just to say that Instituto Escolha is a new think tank. I don't know if you know it. And we do research from our own, but we also want to enhance research on this area of economics and environment. And that's why we have this partnership with INSPER. And we are really pleased and glad that Timo Goeschl accepts our invitation to come. And I hope he'll share his knowledge in this area with us at this time. Thank you.
So let me just explain what's going to happen this morning. So first thing is that we're just going to wrap up from yesterday. There's one thing that we didn't get through, which was the cost-benefit stuff. And then we'll get into the valuation business, right? It's going to keep us busy for most of the day today. So let me just wrap up a little bit from yesterday. So remember, the core concept that I think that most environmental economists think are important for anybody who pretends to be an environmental economist to have some awareness of, right, are this idea that there's a big, a long chain that connects emissions and damages, right? And we spend a lot of time looking at this, even looking at sad soccer experiences in recent Brazilian history to illustrate the point. We've looked at the issue of efficiency, right? And that the notions of efficiency still hold in a world where we have, undesirable outputs. We just need to think a little bit around it, kind of flip things around to understand what efficiency means in these contexts. And then finally, we looked at externalities, right? And this core concept, which is the basic idea that there's something going on there in the economy that is not mediated through markets and prices, right? And because it's not mediated through market and prices, that means that, either government needs to intervene directly, or it means that you need to build those institutions that allow, markets and price to actually do their job. And that is something that we're going to be seeing tomorrow, namely how does the government respond to the presence of externalities. And there's a whole range of different instruments that are available for the policymakers to do this. The one thing that we didn't cover yesterday, because we spent, I think, very valuable time on getting introduced, which I think is a good thing, is that we didn't talk about cost-benefit analysis. So I just want to wrap up a little bit on this point before getting into the valuation bit. And I want to talk about two things in particular, because you could give an entire 6-week course on cost-benefit analysis because there's a lot of complicated detail that exists in CBA once you're going to move beyond the absolute basics, right? And we're not going to have time to actually do this, but I think what's important is that I think there are two developments or two issues that people who do cost-benefit analysis in an environmental contexts need to be aware of, right? And that is the fact that, discounting is much more important in our types of contexts, especially when we deal with long-term environmental problems, right? And of course, the perfect illustration for this is climate change, right? Something we already discussed yesterday, because, even if you emit today, the consequences of those emissions only really, hit the human population in 70 to 100 years, right? And so the question is, well, what exactly does discounting do in a context like this? So we need to think about what it does. And the other thing is distributive effects. There's a lot of discussion, and it's almost predictable. I mean, some of you will have had this experience when you go in and you present projects in a policy-making context. As the economist, you are preoccupied with the efficiency question, right? To what extent does this project actually deliver net welfare gains, and which project variant is the one that delivers the highest welfare gains? But typically, there's a very different concern in the room, and that concern, of course, has to do with who is impacted how, right? So not just the net gains overall, aggregate across everybody, but the question about, well, who are the winners and who are the losers, right, of this policy? And the question is, can you take this into account somehow? Does cost-benefit analysis allow you to do this? And especially in the environmental applications, I think we have a couple of techniques now that allow you to actually address these concerns that people have, right? So let's look into these two issues in detail. So time and distributive effects, that's what I'm interested in. So Just CBA, for those of you who may not be fully familiar with, I mean, it's a tool of policy evaluation, prospective policy evaluation. You try to kind of get as much information about the project, and then you compare for different project variants, the costs and the benefits that this project generates. Sounds completely obvious and common sense, right? But, in a lot of contexts, a lot of policy contexts, it's not compulsory. I don't know, is it compulsory in Brazil for public projects to conduct CBA? No, exactly, right? So there are a lot of countries where it's not mandatory to actually do something that everybody would consider is common sense, right? And it's in the US, it only started in the 1980s. Ronald Reagan made it compulsory. In the EU, again, it's not compulsory in every country. There's different standards. At the EU level, it's only been compulsory since the 2000s to actually do something like this, right? The basic aim, right, if you're engaged in this, is that you want to identify the project variant, that policy that creates the largest surplus, right? That's the basic idea. This is your task, right? And what is that surplus? Well, this is, producer rent plus consumer rent, right? This is the total aggregate net benefits in society. And of course, there are a couple of challenges, right? Because, well, how do you count up those costs and benefits? Well, that requires you to value stuff and to make it comparable, right? And so this is a key problem in valuation, something that we're going to be spending most of today on, namely, once you go beyond stuff that can be readily purchased on the market, well, how exactly do you value these things, right? That's the valuation problem. So how do you convert, especially non-traded, non-market goods and services into commensurable values in dollars or euros or reais, right? You have a problem of spillover, right? Namely, you want to understand, well, once this project becomes of a certain size, it's not just going to do something in this partial market that you're looking at, it's also going to have spillovers into secondary markets, right? For example, if you have a policy that forces every power producer to be installing a flue gas remover, kind of a scrubber device, right, for emissions, well, that's going to have dramatic impacts on the Brazilian scrubber market, right? So you cannot just assume that buying 5,000 of these large machines is going to leave the price for these machines unchanged, right? So you need to take this into account, and you need to look at now the knock-on effects that this might have on other markets, right? So these secondary markets are an important problem. And then you have this problem of intertemporality, right? Namely that, well, typically the project that you're looking at in a public policy context, have immediate costs and long-term benefits, right? And so the question is, well, how do you value, these costs and benefits that arise at different points in time? Right? You need to develop some heuristic to make these things comparable. And the question is, how do you do this? Right? When do you cut off? Right? So what types of time is no longer of interest to you? You cut off in 50 years, or 100 years, or 200 years? Right? And then how do you make those different points in time comparable? Right? And that's the question of the discount rate. And then finally, the equity problem or distribution problem, who gets what? Once you've identified the policy with the largest surplus, it could quite be the case that there's one guy that gets all the surplus and everybody else pays for it, right? It may still be the policy with the largest surplus, but you may not be entirely indifferent as to how those benefits are distributed across the population. The question is, how do you think about this, right? So even when you've settled the valuation question, to which we turn later today, you still need to make some decision about where to cut this thing off, right? CBAs are always incomplete. The question is just how incomplete are they, and how much does the incompleteness matter for the outcome, right? How to consider time, and how to consider the distributive dimension, right? So this is what I want to talk about. So let's just talk about the discounting for a little bit. And there's an entire theory that gives you guidance and an idea about what you do in the short run. And that's actually rather uncomplicated. And any textbook on cost-benefit analysis will give you this information. So I'm not going to deal with this, right? This is really standard. The thing that's of interest to environmental economists is what happens if you have intergenerational effects, right? Stuff you do today impacting, the next generations, 2 generations from now. And then you're in the long run, right? And in the long run, this discounting can really have disturbing consequences. And one illustration of this, right, is a project like this, right? Maybe you have a project that will generate for the next 30 years a payoff of 1 million euros per year, right? But after those 30 years are over, the next 470 years, nothing happens, right? But then in 500 years, right, you're going to have a certain accident, well, that will essentially take 2 trillion off at today's prices, right? Okay. And this makes sense in a German context because this will be the entire GDP, right, of our current output, right? So how do you think about a project like this? Well, if you apply, a 5% discount rate, which would not be unreasonable, right? Yeah. Then the cost of this accident is, let's have a look. What do you guess? How much does it cost?
500 years possible.
Well, give me a guess. 2 trillion. That's a big number, right? So this can take some discounting. But what's going to be the outcome? Who thinks it's more than 1,000 euros? No? Who thinks it's more than 100 euros? Who thinks it's more than 10 euros? Who thinks it's a positive number? So I'm used to when people affirm, they lift their hand. Is this not done in Brazil? So who thinks it's more than 1,000? Can you lift your hand when you think it's more than 1,000? No, nobody thinks it's more than 1,000. More than 10? More than 1? Well, it's 51 euros, right? 51 euros, okay? That sounds like not a lot of money, right? Something that is very easily affordable, right? And this is what people don't like about it, right? The fact that once you expand this into the long horizon, even tremendous damages that you impose on the future, for certain, right, look like nothing today, right? And that seems somehow a problem, right? It's sometimes called the dictatorship of the present, right? The ability of the present generation to be imposing giant costs in the future into the future generations, and it's perfectly defensible with discounting as long as that generation is far enough into the future. Okay? There are a lot of reasons why this may still be a good decision, right? I mean, the counter argument would be, well, let's say you have a project in the economy that for certain yields 5% return per year. Well, then, the answer is that you're going to go in, conduct the project, get the benefits, and you just put 51 euros into a bank account, right? And then 500 years later, right, these guys can just cash in the bank account, right, to offset the damages that will occur, right? The only problem with this is that, if you think about what would have happened in 1517, right? Okay. How much trust would you would have had in 1517 that putting 51 euros into a bank account was going to yield 2 trillion by 2017, right? Okay, so not so obvious, right? So this is something that people struggle with, right? Because if these things are far enough to the future, it seems like you can justify any project you want, right, with this, okay? This is the concern, right, that this discounting might lead to discrimination against future generations. So there are a couple of things, right? And it turns out that 2 things really concern us here, right? One thing that concerns us is the uncertainty, right? And so in the uncertainty world, you might be concerned about the fact that, well, because you don't know what's going to happen over 500 years, many things could happen, right? If you would take 2 countries, that look forward at 500 years, they might undertake completely different development paths, right? In the one country, this might work out just perfectly. In the other country, this might be a complete disaster, right? And a big mistake, right? So risk matters tremendously. But even if you don't take into account the risk, the question is, well, how might you think, even in a risk-free world, about what the right rate would be, right? So this is something that people have been trying to think a lot about because it matters, especially in a climate policy context where we have exactly intertemporal patterns of this type, right? Where emissions today generate benefits today, but the damages occur 70, 100, 200 years from now. Right? And in this context, you want to be able to go to government and tell them, you know what, we haven't just picked a number out of thin air. We actually have a reason why we picked the number that we did. Right? So the question is, what reason, what legitimacy, what justification could you, supply for this? So one thing that people have been looking at is now maybe you can look at risk of return on safe assets, right? So and one candidate for this is assets which are traded in the long run. Okay, and there is stuff like this. U.S. Treasury bonds. Okay, you can sell them many decades into the future, right? And this will be considered something that gives you a risk-free rate of interest on this, right? Because for most intents and purposes, the U.S. government has never defaulted on its debt, okay? So they've always paid up against their debt, and they always can because in the limit, if they were against the wall, they can always tax their citizens, right, to pay you back what you're being owed, right? Okay. And so once you strip out the expected inflation, right, it would actually give you what we want, something that just talks about intertemporal shifting around of assets without taking into account this messy risk business, right, that we're not looking at for the moment. But there are two limitations, right, for this. The first thing is you don't know what inflation is going to be, right? So that's always going to be a noisy thing. So just because you looked at the risk-free rate doesn't make risk go away because there's still uncertainty, right? What the real rate of interest is because you don't know exactly what inflation looks like, right? So this is something that makes this not entirely risk-free, right? But the other problem is that it really cuts your basic time horizon quite substantially because even though these are very long-run bonds by financial market comparisons, looking at the timescales that we have in mind, it's actually a short run, right? 30 to 50 years. There are no bonds that trade for longer than this, right? So anything that happens after 50 years, this interest rate doesn't give you guidance, right? Because there are no bonds between traded that far into the future, right? And the other thing that's unfair, right, and that's something that Diamond, pointed out a long time ago, 1977, right, is that it would only be fair, right, to actually take the prices for these types of assets on the market if the future generations, which will be affected by the actions of today, could also trade on the same market for these bonds, right? And hence determine the interest rate of these things with you. But the problem is they're not there because we haven't been born yet, right? So this market interest rate you see for these bonds cannot fully reflect the interests and the preferences of the future generation because they cannot determine or have an impact on how these prices actually arise, right? And this essentially means that these prices suffer from a dynamic inefficiency because those prices may be reflecting something, but what it's reflecting is the interests and preferences of those that are trading on the market, and that's us, right? And not them in the future, right? So the reflection of preferences there is essentially imperfect, right? So this means that it doesn't really help much to look at these things, right? So another perspective, and this is the one that has really held sway, is to construct this interest rate from first principles, to go back to theory, right, and to build up this interest rate, from first principles out of a theoretical growth model. And this is the so-called Ramsey model, right? And the Ramsey model, we're not going to have time to actually derive it, but what it is, it's a dynamic, a dynamic model of a growing economy, right? And within this growing economy, you can actually make some statements about, the intertemporal welfare conditions. So how would you compare, changes in consumption at different points in time, right? That arise at point 0 and at point 1. How can you do this, right? And there are a couple of things that this model has. Essentially, it means that you can separate, different generations or points in time through times, and you can separate utility across time, right? So utility tomorrow does not depend on what happened yesterday in a direct way, right? That's important, right? So if something that happened yesterday influences how you feel today, then this may not be the perfect model, right? It also is a model that essentially looks at, that kind of takes into account impatience. So the fact that people simply, prefer something today rather than tomorrow, right? And it takes this into account, this impatience, in a way so that this intertemporal welfare, right, is a weighted sum, right, across time, across these different future states of well-being, right? Okay, and so this is actually, well defined, right? And this weight here, right, which we're weighting, this is essentially exponentially decreasing in maturity at some constant rate. So what we're going to get out of this model is going to be, a constant exponential discount rate, right? And this would also lead to consumption smoothing, right? Because our utility function will typically be a power utility function, so one that has some exponent, right? And if you have a power utility function, you always want to smooth consumption through time, right? Why is that? Well, because you have marginal decreasing utility of consumption, right? And once you do this, right, it's going to take us about half an hour to actually derive the model. Let's save this time and just go straight to the result, which is super easy to remember, namely that this Ramsey rule, right, so this discount rate of consumption, actually consists of 3 parameters, right? And these parameters actually can be, approximated and given some empirical reality through time. So there are two taste parameters, right? So one is this rate of impatience, right? So the pure rate of impatience, the question, if the only choice is to consume today or tomorrow, right? How would you compare, these two options with each other, right? And then, this rate of intertemporal inequality aversion, which comes directly from the curvature of the utility function, right? Okay. And this is something that will always make you want to give from the rich generation to the poor generation, right? Irrespective of whether the rich come first and the poor later, or the poor first and the rich later. Which is important once you take into account this factual or empirical parameter, this growth rate g, right? Because this growth rate g actually means that if it's positive, right, then this future generation will be richer, right, than the generation today, right? So this is an important thing. So with these 3 bits, right, you can actually define this R that we have in mind. Okay? So it's important to understand that this is a very different way of arriving at the R, right, from the approach of going to the market, right, and actually measuring it. Okay? Here we are constructing it from first principles, so taking into account something that we think we can empirically measure, namely an idea about how growth rates will develop over this time horizon. We don't know this, but we have an expectation, right? And then these taste parameters, right, they can be given empirical relevance, because there may be different methods that allow you to get to these things, right? In fact, there's an entire body of literature that kind of tries to give you a sense of delta and gamma, right? So once you've calibrated this, you can actually disagree between researchers in a meaningful way, right? Okay, you're all using the same formula, right? But then you can say, all right, we can make a discussion about what is G, what is gamma, what is delta, right? And then essentially we can harness this discussion a bit better, okay? And this is what people do, right? So just to dispel the notion, right, that people agree on these parameters, okay? It kind of gives you, a combination of where these things could be, right? So this is kind of a couple of recent papers that have tried to give you some evidence on this. So the first 3, these are all essentially papers in the climate change cost-benefit analysis literature, right? And you can see that even very eminent economists, Marty Weitzman, Nordhaus, and Nick Stern, fundamentally disagree, about the delta, right? So which was our impatience, right? Okay. There's some agreement on the G, right? And essentially the G is typically a forward projection, right, of past long-run growth rates, right? So somewhere between 1.3 and 2%, right? Okay. And then the gamma, right, which is something about this intertemporal inequality aversion, right? Well, Weitzman and Nordhaus have some agreement here, and Stern, applies this one for which he got a lot of flack, right? Because there is typically some type of relationship in the model that connects the gamma to the delta, right? And this is something that in his model doesn't quite come true. But overall, it kind of gives you not a solution, right? If you look at the R's, right, they're quite different. We have anything from 1.4 to 6%, right? But at least it gives you a structure for how we can debate, right, about this, because to the extent that that we may converge, on the empirical implementation of these parameters, you would expect that these R's would also converge together. The last two bits are a bit more interesting from the policy point of view because they are an attempt by policymakers to actually use these types of academic insights and build them into policy making, right? The UK Green Book, I'll be talking about this again in a moment, is what the UK government uses in order to make project evaluation, right? Whenever there's a public project in the UK, you are obligated to take the Green Book, right, and follow the rules of the Green Book to assess the project, right? So the fact that they write 3.5 in there, actually has significance, right? Because every time you build an airport or a water treatment plant or some power plant, this is how the government is supposed to look at these things, right? And they cannot deviate from this. And the Lebesgue report essentially is something very similar of the same type for France. Okay, so these things actually have political traction because they are mandatorily inbuilt into this process, right? So we looked at the risk-free rate, right? And we saw how you can derive the risk-free rate from these basic 3 parameters that come out of the Ramsey rule, right? We haven't looked at risk, right? And risk, of course, we can do an entire semester course on risk. So, but one very simple way in which you can build in risk, right, is simply take into account, that or just realize a very simple mathematical fact, namely that that arithmetic and geometric series do not behave in the same way, right? And how can you see this? Well, so here in this table, this is from a 2013 paper in Science, where people try to communicate to scientists essentially what is the basic notion about intertemporal comparison of costs and benefits in a climate change context. As you can see here, if you just look at these first 3 examples, 1%, 4%, 7%, you see how as we go forward in time, from 1 year into the future to 400 years into the future, how these different discount rates have tremendous impact, right, on how you evaluate $1,000, that arise in the future, right? So at 1%, we're still left at least with $18 after 400 years. Once you have 4% or 7%, this is essentially 0. You could say that if you choose a 4% discount rate, essentially anything that is above 100 years doesn't count. If you take 7%, essentially anything that's above, well, about 60 years, 70 years doesn't really count anymore, right? So this is the basic thing, what we knew, maybe that discount rates matter, okay? But what's also interesting is to say, well, if you assume that it could be 1%, growth rate or discount rate with 50% probability, or it could be 7 with 50% probability, then is it really true that the certainty equivalent of this is just the halfway point between this? No, it's not, right? Because if you take the certainty equivalent, this would mean that if you take it 1 year, 1 and 7, this is reasonably close to 3.5, right? But as you go towards 400 years, you're approaching more and more, the 1% discount rate, okay? So this means the 1% discount rate becomes more and more important as you go into the future, right? Relatively speaking, simply because geometric, series run differently. And this has big implications, right? Because it means that, this thing, 4% on average, right? It actually looks very different in an uncertain world, and you get a curve that looks at the future in a declining fashion, right? And this is something that you can see, right? Namely that as you look at these different time horizons, the actual discount rate that you apply changes with the time horizon at which you're applying it, right? And the more you look into the future, right, the lower the discount rate becomes, right? And this is a phenomenon that's called hyperbolic discounting, right? Okay, so it's not exponential, where you apply the same discount rate to every time horizon. Here, the discount rate that you apply changes with the time horizon that you look at. Okay. And this actually becomes important, right? Because that means that we are partially avoiding this curse, right, of making everything go to 0, right? That happens far enough into the future because we're taking into account the fact that the lower discount rate becomes relatively more important in the long run, right? And this again, actually has been, built into, the Green Book, right? So if you compare, different comparisons, right, of discount rates in the future, and now you build in the hyperbolic discounting out, you have this effect you just saw in this little paper, namely that this thing comes down, right? And this is exactly the pattern that the Green Book, right, is imposing on policymakers in the UK, right? So essentially the Green Book tells the policymaker that they need to take into account that, if you look at longer time runs, right, the discount rate that they need to apply, right, is starting to deviate, from the exponential discount rate over time. Okay, so this becomes important. So this is the question of discounting, right? And so in the long run, hyperbolic discounting makes sense. We have an argument why it should happen. We can derive it from first principles, right? And it's something that we should be taking into account when we look at time horizons which are long enough into the future. The basic idea is, right, you can essentially have a two-step procedure, right, which is not, it's not entirely kosher, right, but it's kind of a heuristic shortcut, right? The heuristic shortcut is essentially to kind of go in and to look at, reasonable manifestations, right, that you think where your uncertainty distribution across the delta, the gamma, and the delta lies, right? And then based on this, you can build essentially distributions out of this, right, which you can then derive the implicit or the certainty equivalent rate that gives you this hyperbolic discounting. And this, in fact, is what Groom et al. Do in their paper, right? Essentially what they do is they go to experts, right, and elicit expert estimates, right, about what these things are, right? And based on this, they kind of construct a probability distribution over these things, right? And then derive from that, right, this hyperbolic rate, okay? So, and why do you do this? Well, because essentially, this is the best you have, right? Essentially a population estimate among experts about what these parameters could be, right? Because people will, even if you have the same method that you apply and the same empirical thing, you're not going to get the same results, right? And people may disagree about the weight that they would like to attach to the delta that this study elicited as opposed to the delta that study elicited, right? So in this sense, this Groom paper, I think, is, in my mind, the best representation of the available information in the community of, economists, what the population of deltas, G's, and gammas could be, right? And then deriving from this hyperbolic discount rate, right? So, and of course it matters, right? So if you had a different distribution, you would get a very different discount rate, right? So the other issue, right, is distribution, right? And this is a big a big issue in project evaluation, right? Because everybody who looks at the project, right, not from the point of view of the disinterested economists, but from the point of view of people who are affected by the project, they very quickly understand, where people will fall, right, in terms of being a winner, a net winner, or a net loser from this policy, right? And this is something that has attracted a lot of attention in the US. It's tied together with a debate called environmental justice or environmental injustice. I'm not quite sure to what extent that's a debate that kind of takes place in Brazil as well. But it kind of goes back to something that kind of happened essentially got started in the 1980s, early 1990s. Essentially the realization that for some reason, impoverished, economically disadvantaged communities tend to end up, with worse environment than, other types of communities, right? And there's a large literature that I would really encourage you to read. One of the really interesting one, this one here, this Dumping in Dixie, right? Essentially, that kind of tracks the development of waste disposal in the American South and this interesting pattern where toxic waste, for example, ends up, right? And there is a pattern to where it ends up, right? There's nothing accidental about it, right? So, so in this context, right, this has put some strain on, cost-benefit analysts, right, to actually make some statements about, well, what are the equity implications of what we do, right, of a project that might be executed, right? Because if you look at any type of policy measure, this was projection for the French carbon tax, and you look at different parts of the income distribution, first decile up to the 10th decile of the distribution. You look at different components, how this carbon tax might impact their heating ability, their fuel costs, and where people live, whether they live in the countryside, right, or whether they live in town, right, you find that, well, across these different deciles in the income distribution, there are some important net effects, right? There are some people after transfers that kind of end up, with positive, some end up, significantly negative, right? And it also makes a big difference where you live, right? So even in the same income income decile, it really depends on where you live in town or in city, how you're going to be affected by this, right? So policies always impact in a different way, right? And most of the time, it's almost impossible to find any policy that does not somehow, generate a loser, right? And the question is, who is the loser? Is the loser a rich guy or a poor guy? And we may be concerned about the loser being the poor guy because he's already poor, right? So to what extent should we take this into account? So there's a big discussion in economics and cost-benefit analysis whether cost-benefit analysis should be taking this into account. And there are powerful arguments that would tell you you should not take this into account, right? And the reason why you shouldn't, we're the economists in the room. So what's the powerful argument why you say, well, I don't care about this? What's the argument? It's a very basic argument in welfare economics. And the doctrine of separability tells you, well, first you pick the project that maximizes total benefits, right? And then what can you do? Exactly. You do lump sum transfers, right? So if you're unhappy with the ex post distribution, well, you just take from the rich and give to the poor, right? And somehow, even out the winner and loser situation. And you know that there is, the money is there because you chose the best project, right? So you created the largest pie, right? So you can take part of this gain and redistribute it as you please, right? And as long as you do it in a lump sum fashion, right, there are I'm blanking out for a moment, there are no distortionary impacts, right, on the economy, right, because people don't change their actions in response to this. So this is the important doctrine, right, that counts against this. But a counter argument, and it would still be the case, right, that this would work, in a setting where marginal utility, is decreasing because it just means that, well, taking $1 from, a very rich guy like Andre and giving it to you, a very poor guy, Bruno, right? For him, losing, these $1,000, right, is worth less than it's worth to you, right? And so this is actually very easy to kind of justify these lump sum transfers. But the problem is that it's not always, those lump sum transfers in reality don't happen, right, very often. And if they happen, we have the problem what's called leaky buckets, right? Namely that what I'm taking from Andre to give to Bruno, I'm taking the $1,000 here, but there's distance between you, right? There is, administrator, the tax system, the public policy, the banks, blah, blah. So the $1,000 I took from you end up with $300 when they reach you, right? And that's the leaky bucket, right? This bucket in which I put the money is losing water as I carry it around, right? And so it's not always obvious, right, that we can actually make this transfer, right? And even if the bucket is not leaky, what we find is very often policymakers don't do them. Okay? They could do them, okay, but they're not happening. Okay? So if they're not happening, then the question is to what extent should you take this into account that we live in a world where those lump sum transfers are very often just not done, right? And then you may want to have cost-benefit analysis, take this into account. And typically, in my experience, it's always interesting when you're in a meeting with policymakers or people that are concerned with this type of with cost-benefit analysis, this project evaluation, they will always hit the economist over the head, saying, "Oh, you're not taking this into account." But what's surprising is, it's very often surprising to them, is that actually it's been a long time, okay, since we've had the tool to do it, right? In fact, since the mid-1980s. We actually have the theory that supports taking distributional weights into account. And this goes back to a couple of papers by Jacques Drèze and Nick Stern, the same Stern from the climate change, right? That essentially gives you, an approach that augments the CBA with distributive weights, right? And this is actually very simple because what we do, we take Bruno's approach, right? The famous Sousa approach to welfare evaluation, and we take into account declining marginal utility of consumption, right? And we use this information, right, to essentially augment our evaluation of the impacts. And once we do that, right, we can arrive at a system where we look at benefits and costs based on the position of somebody in the income distribution. Right? And in fact, the Green Book in the UK does exactly this. Right? So the Green Book essentially has, a formula. Now, we can disagree whether this is the right formula, okay, but they have a formula where they take this into account, right, that people in different parts of the income distribution may be affected differently, right? So essentially what they do, right, is a very simplified attempt where they assume, that, utility has a log function, right? So utility is a log in consumption, which essentially gives you the marginal utility of consumption as 1 over C, right, first derivative of this thing, right? And then since you, of course, cannot observe consumption, right, you only observe incomes typically, right? You kind of take income as a proxy for consumption, and then you apply distributional weight, right? That kind of looks at the individual marginal utility as a percentage of the average marginal utility, and that essentially puts a greater weight on people which are relatively less well off, and a smaller weight on those which are more well off. In fact, you can this is a little example, right? Somehow this thing moved around a bit. Let me pull this down. This might help. Okay. So here, this is like a didactic example, right? Mickey Mouse example, right? So consider 2 options, right, for implementing some specific biodiversity policy, right? And then that these 2 policies, either one you choose, will always impact somebody negatively, right? The assumed median income is $40,000, right, in this economy, right? So you have, the policy 1, the policy 2, right? If you look at, the poor guys here, right, they have an aggregate marginal willingness to pay to avoid the impacts from this project of 10,000. There are 1,000 of them, right? That means their marginal willingness to pay for the individual is $10, right? They have annual individual income of 20,000, right? And that gives them, a distributive weight of 2, right? Because, they only have half, right, of what this income is, right? And if you now put this into what this means in terms of applying, this factor to, how they value this policy, well, this gives you 20,000, right? Policy 2, this is where the rich are impacted. They would be willing to pay 5 times as much, right, as the poor guys to avoid the policy, right? And your standard rule would say, well, the rich are willing to pay 5 times as much as the poor to avoid the policy, right? So we should certainly do policy 1, right? Because that imposes a lower cost on society, right? Okay. But here now, because we apply these weights, going to run a bit differently. We have 1,000 rich guys, individually, right? Everybody is willing to pay 50, right? 50 times 1,000, 50,000 is how we get there. These guys have an individual income 10 times as much as these guys here, right? But that means that applying this basic rule, right, means that they have a distribution weight of 0.2, right? So it means that we apply, this distribution weight to their willingness to pay, and that makes their distribution-adjusted policy worth only 10,000. So now these guys are suddenly so their resistance is worth 20,000, right? While their resistance is only worth, 10,000, okay? 0.2 times 5, right? So applying this rule, right? Now this, of course, is a Mickey Mouse example. Okay, it's a weird society, 1,000 super rich guys, that earn 10 times as much as the 1,000 really poor guys, right? But, of course, this is for didactic purposes only, but it demonstrates to you how this rule here, right, this 1 over, right, essentially gives you a completely different outcome now, because now that you've applied this distribution adjusted weight, you actually do, follow policy 1, right, rather than, policy 2, right? So this is the basic illustration how these weights suddenly, can shift, right, the policy around dramatically, because you take into account that the poor or the rich are, impact in a different way, right? And you take into account, or you measure, you apply weights to, their willingness to pay to avoid the impacts, right? So this is possible, right? And it's certainly something that in some real life examples, governments employ, right? Okay, so this kind of gives the economist, some reason, some credibility to apply this type of approach in this context, right? So this just means, that, in a cost-benefit, approach, right? We want to follow the basic rationality, right, of economics in comparing cost and benefits, and it provides a rational framework for applying these contexts. And just in other types of contexts, of CBA, surplus matters, markets matters, all these effects matters, but what also matters is time and space and distributive effects, right? And it also means that, if you want to then apply these techniques in an analytical context, you just need to show awareness and ideally incorporate some of these more sophisticated techniques which are available in the literature. Okay, so that was the wrap up, right? And with this, essentially, we have the toolbox ready, right, to start going. So with this in mind, we're not going to break. Yes, we want to salvage this. Okay, so, and move essentially to the question of valuation. Okay, now valuation we already mentioned, right? Because we said, well, if we want to do cost-benefit analysis of the environment, somehow we need to populate our spreadsheets with numbers, right? The question is, where will those numbers come from, right? And that's the valuation exercise. Let me motivate this issue of valuation in 4 little examples that all have their own little valuation history. What you see here is a butterfly, obviously. Does anybody know the butterfly? We don't have a, sorry? We don't have a lepidopterologist, that's what they're called, in the room. No hobby lepidopterologists, okay, fair enough. This is something called, well, it's written there, Macunea teleos, right? So, and this actually is a butterfly that is under severe threat in Europe, right? It's a butterfly that has co-evolved with agriculture over the last 10,000 years in Europe. And the problem is that because it has co-evolved, it's kind of developed a lifestyle that's a little bit expensive by modern standards. It requires the farmer to, not to put any fertilizer on the pasture, to only mow the grass not more than twice a year at very particular points in time, right? And modern farmers don't run their pastures in this way, right? So that means that farmers are required to change their land use practices in order for this butterfly to survive, okay? But the question is, given that they have to change their management practices, well, that's costly, right? They could make better use of the land, right? If we just would allow them to mow as often as they want, put the fertilizer on if they need it, etc., okay? So these are costs. And the question is, well, just how many farmers or how many hectares of land do you want to set aside to support this population of butterfly, right? In order to answer this question, you need to know something. What's that? Well, you need to know how much where it happens. Well, that's all important, right? So the biology is all important, right? And it's important to understand what what exactly it costs the farmer to do this. Okay. Now, and there are many reasons why it could be worth something, right? Why it matters? Well, the reason why it matters, the butterfly doesn't matter as such, right? So, nature will take its course whether this butterfly is there or not. Okay, nothing depends on that butterfly. Okay, but people still may love the butterfly because they like butterflies and they might like diversity in butterflies. But the question is, just how much diversity do they want, right? So how important is it to them, right? So is a butterfly like this worth €1? Is it worth 1,000 euros? Right? So this is the answer that we need to have, and without this information, there's no way to design a rational conservation policy because you don't know, do you need like 1 hectare or 1,000 hectares, right, in order to do this? What's the right amount for this context, right? So this is a key problem, right? And it's a key problem in conservation policy because you would like to, be able to provide some information on this to the policymaker. Second example. We transport oil around the world in ships like this. And this is a very famous ship. It's called the Exxon Valdez, right? And the Exxon Valdez became famous because of a drunk driving incident, right? Okay. The Exxon Valdez does what a lot of oil tankers in North America do. They ship oil down from terminals in Alaska, right, along a waterway called the Strait of Juan de Fuca down to the big processing ports along the West Coast, down to San Francisco, Oakland, LA, etc. Right? And one of the most interesting parts of the journey of the oil tanker is when they leave. Okay, the terminal, which is up here, close to Valdez, right? And they're supposed to navigate these waters in a very particular way, as you can see here. Namely, if you're leaving, you're supposed to stay on this side of the shore, right? So the white stuff here is the water. the dark stuff is the land, right? So you're supposed to go this way out, and this is how you come in, right? Well, it turns out in this case, the captain decided to call it an early day and left the bridge, right? Something happened to the first officer that was never entirely clarified. Competing accounts to this. And so we see what the Exxon Valdez did with its freshly loaded oil tanker. It was on course at 23:06, 23:12. About 20 minutes later, it started to veer off course, and then, about half an hour later, it hit the rocks, right? So it hit the rocks somewhere in Alaska, right, and spilled a lot of oil, tons of oil, right? And this oil spread, right, in a dramatic fashion, all around these, sizable areas up to 500 miles, right, from this site. Now, the problem with spilling 260,000 tons of oil really depends on where you choose to spill them. You probably remember the Deepwater Horizon, right, in the Gulf of Mexico, right? Now, that was an event that was much larger than the Exxon Valdez, right? But most of the problems have disappeared. Why? Because it happened in tropical waters, right? And there's a whole bunch of bacteria out there and microorganisms in the water that just love crude oil, okay? So a lot of it just gets processed by nature, right? It just gets eaten up, right, by bacteria and other types of microorganisms. But up there, it's very cold, okay? So there isn't a lot of biological dynamic in this system, okay? Which means that this stuff sticks around, okay? It sticks around for a long time. It's very costly to remove, because, of the types of conditions under which, Alaska operates, right? So the question is, well, how do we value an impact like this, right? Well, when you go up there, you see that, well, there's some private claims, right, from people that may be directly impacted, some Inuit, some fishermen, okay? But, most of the damage here, right, occurred to fish, wildlife, and shorelines. Why? Because there's almost nobody that lives up there, right? So if you go back to our evaluation example from yesterday, where all of the music was in mortality, morbidity impacts on human life, right? Well, up there, if there's nobody there, right, does this mean that this is an accident that, didn't really do any damage, right? Is this a fair assessment of what goes on? And if we send the signals to, the owners of oil tankers that, it's okay to be spilling your oil in Alaska because, this is an area where nobody lives, we may not be happy with the consequences, right, of this type of message, right? So the stuff that was hurt was these things here: sea otters, harbor seals, seabirds, and soiled beaches on which no tourist ever sets foot. Okay? The question is this worth anything, right? Can you put a number to this, right? When you go to, the Exxon Corporation, what's the bill, right, that you ask them for, right? So this is a big question, right? So the federal government, the state of Alaska, wanted to sue, right? They wanted to set a precedent that, this type of behavior, which was obviously due to negligence, criminal negligence, right, by, the operator of the ship, right? This cannot just be accepted like this, right? You need to go back and, somehow, make them pay for the damages. The question is, what are the damages, right? Can you put a number to the damages, right? And can the sea otters and the harbor seals and the seabirds, do they have a voice in court, right? Do they have a value that we can attach to this, right? So how much should they be asking for? 1 million, 10 million, 100 million, a billion, 10 billion? What's the right number, right, that you ask for, right? And this is the question that, exercised, an entire part of the emerald economics community in the 1990s, right? How can you make a statement about what this right value is, right? So I want to understand a little bit more about this. Example 3, air quality in Germany, okay? Germany is generally reputed to be a fairly green and clean country. Well, not so, not so. Okay. In fact, air pollution in Germany is on average higher than it is in the US, right? A lot of it has to do with diesel cars being used. Okay, this is a big issue, and it's also because Germany still uses a lot of brown coal, so very bad quality coal, in order to produce electricity. Right. This leads to the fact that we have a lot of German cities, and they're all in red here, that are actually violating air quality standards, right, in a major way. Right. So the question is, well, you could do a variety of things about this, right? So this is nitrous oxide, right? So this is mostly traffic produced, right? And so if it's traffic produced, well, there are a couple of things you could do, right? You could just put fees on cars which are old or have a certain technology installed, right? You could force everybody to be installing a filter on their device, or ban cars that don't have a filter. You could just ban traffic, right, which is going to happen in some cities, right? So you ban selectively certain cars from entering the city. It's going to happen later this year, right? But of course, or you could adapt, right? Just leave pollution unchanged, but make people accept more pollution. For example, we could subsidize the purchase of face masks, right? So that people will suffer less from the pollution that's around them, right? We could tell people that they're no longer allowed to go outdoors to exercise, because it's too dangerous, right? Well, possibly a way to reduce the damage. But it's quite obvious with these examples, right, that they're all costly, right? So traffic typically happens for a reason, right? Some people drive for fun, but most people don't drive for fun most of the time. Okay, so all this stuff, banning, technological requirements, all this costs money, right? The question is, just what is it worth to us? What are we willing to accept, right, in order to improve air quality in German cities, right? So what are we willing to pay, right, to give up to bring those red dots into compliance, right? So a big valuation issue, right? And then finally, of course, example 4, climate change, right? Well, climate change will do all kinds of stuff, right? Change temperatures, precipitation, atmospheric composition, right? This will change plants and animals and humans, right? Both in agriculture, right? So managed systems, and everywhere else, okay? And the IPCC essentially tells you a lot about how these things will play out in different points of time and different places on planet Earth, as we go forward. Okay? So these are all impacts, and the question is, well, and this has all kinds of impacts on energy production, consumption, tourism. Tourism actually is a big factor. For some reason, not much researched. 10% of global GDP comes out of tourism, right? So this is something that is important. Construction, transport, labor productivity, and so on, right? The question is, well, we also have human health impacts, sea level rise. Okay, so with this plethora of impacts, the question is, well, what are we willing to do about it? Okay, so how much is it worth, right, for us to actually engage in action that will limit these types of activities? And of course, when you remember yesterday, what is done in integrated assessment models, but that's an attempt to somehow quantify in a very simple way how these things might be costed in some way. But it's not a substitute for actually going out and doing a evaluation exercise. So let's see how we can get to this. So this means in all these 4 examples, right, the question always is, can we make a statement about what this stuff is worth in a world where you cannot find a price for this on the market? There's no price for air quality in Germany. There's no price for avoiding climate change. There's no price for sea otters, and there's no price for, butterflies. Okay? So somehow we need to have, an approach, right, that allows us to value this stuff and to put it into a CBA. And here's the challenge, right? You want to put it into the cost-benefit analysis in a way that is justifiable, right? What I mean by justifiable is that the way you put it in there does not violate, right, or conflict with the very theoretical, conceptual underpinnings of cost-benefit analysis, right? So it needs to be an approach that follows the same logical conceptual premises of CBA. So when we say, well, this is $5,000, we can compare these $5,000 of value for a sea otter, right, with the fact that, well, you're willing to pay $5,000 to live in a larger house, right? And these are the same units, and we can compare them, right? And that's the challenge, right, to kind of actually develop a framework for doing this. And this is what embedded economics has done, essentially over 30, 40 years, building up a conceptual framework that allows us to derive numbers that can be interpreted conceptually in the same way as dollars that you spend on your holiday, on your iPhone, or whatever, right? And that's the challenge, right? So let's look into this theory, kind of the basic ideas that underpins this, just to make you confident the next time that you have to testify in court, for in an environmental lawsuit, that when you say, well, the cost-benefit analysis did this and this and this, that you're actually on safe ground, right? You're on safe ground because those numbers that you are citing there actually do mean the same thing as the dollars that you're comparing to this for the cars or the other stuff. It is the same thing that you're talking about. And why is it the same thing? Well, it is the same thing because the way that we go about this valuation exercise essentially looks at environmental goods and services in the same way that we look at environmental goods and services, in a normal consumer theory framework. So it's the same fundamental welfare economic approach that underpins both of these things. So that means that we need some type of demand theory, right, for these goods. Just like there's a demand for iPods and a demand for bananas and something else, there's also demand for butterflies, for clean air, right, and for avoiding climate change, right? But it's not quite so simple, right? Because, remember, yesterday, because the goods that we're dealing with here, will have typically the characteristic of public goods. And that's the reason why we don't have a price for them, right? Because they're not allocated through markets, right? So we need to have something that makes this consumer theory now stick for public goods being supplied, right? And that means you need to adopt the basic welfare economic concepts of equivalent and compensating variation, which are about price changes in private goods, right, to a context where we have quantity changes in public goods, okay? So we need something that works like that, right? Because we're not looking at a price change. We're looking at a supply change of a public good, right? Right? Because here, in the end, if we say, well, we want to have a project that, makes sure that we have, more seals or more butterflies, right? Well, those butterflies will be supplied and they will be there whether you like them or you don't like them, okay? So the outcome of the policy is the supply of a public good, right? So we need to value your response, right, to more of this public good being supplied, right? And this is what we are determining here, right, exogenously, right? In fact, you can actually make this explicit, right, if you kind of write down the relevant functions, right? So, and this is called restricted demand and expenditure functions. So essentially, you kind of go back to basic theory, right, and you simply augment, the utility functions with, a statement about some environmental good, right? For example, noise, right? There will be a typical environmental bad, right, that you don't want to have, right? Which would then enter, into your demand functions, your Hicksian demand function, your expenditure function, right? Essentially as an additional argument, right? And you would say, well, because noise is there, right? For example, my demand for garden chairs is now lower, right? Right? Because my garden is a less pleasant environment, right? Because there's noise, right? So the fact that there's noise there, well, that affects my demand for garden chairs, right? Okay. So this plays a role in determining the demand function, and if it does that, well, it also determines the compensated demand function, and it would enter into the expenditure function the same way, right? So this just makes explicit the fact that this consumer makes choice about private goods in a world in which public goods are being supplied exogenously, and where there's an interaction between the supply of the public goods and all the other things he purchases in the economy, right? This is the basic idea, okay? And essentially what you then do, right, is kind of use, this restricted demand, curve information in order to, then make some statements about marginal willingness to pay, right, for some environmental good, right? And you can do this, right, because the concept of willingness to pay works essentially in the same way as a price, okay? And the way that we can write this down, right, is that, well, if the environmental good had a price, right, then we would be able to make a statement about, well, what exactly is that price? Well, just in the same way as you would do for a private good, namely, well, if I change the quantity of the private good I'm supplying to you, right, I look at the expenditure function, how this changes, well, it changes exactly by the price of the good, right? This is the same concept here, right? If it had a price, well, then this thing here, right, would give us a very precise statement about, well, what exactly is the consumer willing to pay at the margin, right, for an additional unit of this good, right? And of course, we don't have this price, but if this is a correct mathematical derivation, which it is, right, then whatever pops out here at the other end, right, must be something that works like the consumer end, right, of this demand valuation, right? And this is nothing else but the marginal willingness to pay, right? Right? And so that means that we have, as long as we have the expenditure function defined, right, we can actually derive this thing, right? And so this is important, right? It tells you that this willingness to pay is actually well identified, right? So if the arguments are known in the expenditure function, you can actually derive from observables, right, what marginal willingness to pay is. Okay? And that means this is not just a number you made up, right? It's something that is actually grounded, right, in the basic framework of consumer theory. Okay? And that means that you can now, say something about how people value changes in the supply of this good by making something equivalent to the concepts of equivalent and compensating, compensation, right? But now looking at what happens to welfare when we change environmental quality from some level, say Q0 to Q1, right? And because they're not, equivalent and compensating variations, right? They are changes in the surplus that you are experiencing, right? This is just the supply of a public good with no budgetary implication, right? So all that we have here is the surplus that comes to you of more of this being supplied. So these things are called equivalent and compensating surplus, okay? So this is just now the counterpart, right, to equivalent and compensating variation, right? Instead of looking at what's the impact of a price change of a private good, right? We now look what's the impact on welfare of the change in the supply of a public good, right? And that gives you, the definition of the surplus. A little aside, when in the courtrooms in the US, people then discuss how to apply, whether or not these valuations based on valuation theory should, really matter for the court's determination of the damages that, need to be paid. It's an interesting strategy nowadays that lawyers for the defense would tell the jury that they should note that the idea of the equivalent and compensating surplus was a concept invented by Karl Marx. Which is bad news in the US, right? It seems like, oh no, the plaintiffs are communists, right? So this surplus actually, has some traction. So essentially, you can then make a statement about what these things are, right? By now saying, well, let's just define utility before the change, as U0, after the change exposed as U1, right? And then essentially, we can talk about this compensating and equivalent surplus essentially as changes to income, right? So this is the compensating surplus, right? Is the amount of money that you transfer to or from the consumer, right? To ensure that, well, the utility level that you enjoy at the new level of the public being supplied, right, is the same as before if we take CS away or put to your budget, right? And the same thing, equivalent surplus, right, is transferred to, well, now the new reference point is, the new level of utility that you would enjoy. So how much it would take to hold your level of environmental quality constant, and now we give you income, right, that make you as well off as you would be if at the previous income you would enjoy, this new level of environmental quality Q1, right? So this is the basic idea. And because we do it like this, right, essentially what we're doing is we're converting, these changes in environmental quality from Q0 to Q1 into income equivalents, right? Okay. So we can really make a statement if we follow this logic, right? We can really make a statement that, changing noise from, 68 to 78 decibels is equivalent to taking away X amount of euros from your income, right? This is the basic idea, right? Okay. And this step is required so we can knowledgeably, then take this result to cost-benefit analysis and say, well, this is like an income change, right, for you. Okay, and this is the basic idea that's required. So you can now reformulate compensating surplus and equivalent surplus, right? And just like in the equivalent and compensating variation, right, all that matters is the reference level, right? So the compensating variation, essentially, refers back to the original level of utility, the equivalent, to the putative, level of utility, right? These are techniques that are familiar to you from, equivalent and compensating variation, right? And in both of these cases, right, essentially we always have this income change, right, as the key question of, how much would you have to give somebody to have this change in quality, right, based on these reference points. In fact, you can, make this graphically, right? You can look at, two levels of utility, U0, U1, right? And then you can look at, actually the impact of what happens when we change elemental quality, right, in a setting where we have some well-defined utility function. It's always assumed, right? So let's say we have the quantity or quality of the elemental good here. Here's income, right? So we have, quality before, quality after. And let's say we go from low to high quality, right? Let's say you start at point A. This is where you're located before, right? And so the willingness to pay for this improvement E, well, this is just this difference here, right? I mean, we hold you at this constant thing here, right? We compare, well, how much are you better off now, right? Because we have improved elemental quality, from this level E0, right, to this level here. And this is the income equivalent, right? And you can read this off essentially on this side here, right? How much this income would have had to change, right, to give you the same change in utility level, right, as you experience from going from E0 to E1, right? And of course, you can do it the other way around, right? You can start at B, right? And you can say, well, given that this is what you could have had, right, how much are you losing, right, by the fact that we are now reducing elemental quality from E1 to E0, right? And this can then give you, statements about equivalent surplus. But it's also clear that depending on where you start, right, what the reference points are, these are not always the same measures, right? Because the reference point has changed, right? And so this means that it's important to understand when you put these things in, what exactly it is that you're comparing as the default situation, right, and the situation that you're comparing this with. Okay? I've never found out how I can do these types of presentations on two of these screens at the same time. So does this actually work for you? Can you see what I'm doing? Yes? Okay. Good. But the pointer doesn't. I'm wondering whether you can actually see this. So okay. So this means that there's a simple logic, right, that you can then apply, to compensating equivalent surplus, right? It says, well, if you have an improvement, right, then compensating surplus measures the willingness to pay for the change occurring. The equivalent surplus is the willingness to accept compensation for the change not occurring, okay? And if you have a deterioration in the quality, so we go, from E1 to E0, right? Then this compensating surplus is the willingness to accept compensation for the change occurring, right? Or willingness to pay for the change not to occur, right? And so it always switches the reference point around, right? And then you say, well, no, do we need to compensate you or give you income in order to do this? So this is the basic idea, okay? And essentially most of the time, people by now are confident enough to say, well, we know that this works. Okay, we've done this now for 30 years. This is actually proper theory. There are still some tricky issues that occur at some of the finer points of the theory, but for the most part, this is rock solid, right? So you can go to court and feel confident, that this actually is consistent, with the framework of cost-benefit analysis. So, but we're not interested so much in the theory, right? That's done. Good. Thank you, theoreticians. What does this mean for valuation, right? How can we actually take this, and make something with this? And this is something that requires to have an idea about what exactly we're trying to measure. And so, two things we need to understand is that there are different types of values that we're interested in, right? And that depending on the value that we try to measure, okay, different methods may be more or less appropriate in order to do this. So let's look at the types of things that we may be interested in. And I really like this graph. I show it at least 3 times a year. Because for me, it's always helpful when I'm in a room with policymakers that have also invited not just economists, but also ecologists and environmentalists and everybody else to the room, right? Which is good, okay? I think these people are important, okay? But typically, there's a presumption in the room that economists are only interested in a very narrow set of things, right? And at that point, I always pull out this slide. Say, well, it's not like that, okay? We actually consider a very broad array, right, of values when we look at the environment, okay? It's just that some of these values are easier to get to quantify than others, okay? But it's important, first of all, to say that we're interested in values which are not easy to quantify. And let's talk about, this array of values that we may be interested in. So what we're really interested in, fundamentally, in things that have to do with the environment, is what's called the total economic value, right? And this total economic value has a couple of different components, right? And some of these things, and so there are various ways of categorizing them, but a typical dichotomy is that this value can be split up in what's called use values and non-use values. And the basic idea that kind of differentiates use values from non-use values is that in the case of non-use values, you are a direct beneficiary, right, of this good, being consumed or being around, existing, right? In the non-use context, you are not a direct beneficiary. And it becomes clearest when you go through examples to make clear what exactly we mean. The use values is the stuff that, most people would associate economists with. And typically, in fact, when you're in the room with these environmentalists, they always think that you're only interested in this, right? Namely, consumptive use values. So types of use values where the good essentially disappears in use, okay? So one typical output of nature is apples, right? And that's obviously a consumptive value, right? And once you take the apple and you consume it, well, there's one apple less in the world, right? So this is obvious, and we know how to put a price on the apple because we can go to the market and we see, well, there's an equilibrium price with some dispersion around it, but this kind of gives you a pretty close idea about what this thing is worth. So easy to quantify, okay? Straightforward. But of course, there's some consumption values which are a bit more esoteric, right? But it's easier then to kind of go towards the amenities which are kind of overlapping this, because amenities are a type of consumption in which the good does not disappear. Okay? I know, last weekend, did anybody go for a walk? Is this something people do in Sao Paulo? I don't know. Okay. So when you went for a walk, where did you go? To a park? Exactly. Right? You went to a park. Now, after you left the park, right, the park was in the same self-condition as you were, hopefully, as when you entered it, okay? Unless you left behind some garbage, which you wouldn't do, right? So the park was there, and the park was the same, right, before and after the use, right? So, but still, you got a benefit out of it, right? And that's the amenity value, the fact that the parks provide you with a service, right? Okay. And what determines the quality of this experience, right, is the stock, right? Some stock definition of what the park is. So a larger park provides more of a benefit. A more diverse park, more of a benefit, right? There's some quality characteristics of the park that make walking in it more or less, enjoyable, right? And this is a value, right? Because you went there for a reason, right? You went there because you were satisfying some type of need, right, that you had, namely for being outdoors and moving around a bit, right? And this is the amenity value that this park provided, right? So this is something we're interested in, right? Because there are a lot of goods and services that nature provides, which are not compromised by us using them, but we still benefit from them, right? And of course, when you go into climate change, you look at the amenities that the climate system provides, in terms of keeping the temperature, in a range that's actually allows humans to exist, shielding us from, harmful UV radiation, providing precipitation when we need it most of the time, sometimes when we don't need it. Okay, there's all kinds of services that get provided. Think about, watersheds, with forests that provide water retention services, and you always only, find out that you had these services once you cut the forest down and find out that all of a sudden, you have, flash floods, and events like this, right? So there are kinds of services that get provided, and everybody who's in the room, an environmental engineer, I mean, this is part of the stuff that you're being taught, that there are these services out there that need to be taken into account, right? So, and then, so this is kind of straightforward enough. Option values is a bit more esoteric, right? It's a statement about the fact that nature may matter to you in certain states of the world, which may arise with a certain probability, right? So, for example, has anybody been on a safari tour here? But you may want to go to a safari tour, right? And once you were on the safari tour, maybe since you were a child, you always wanted to see elephants and giraffes, right? So in order to make sure that there are still elephants and giraffes around when you really go on the safari, it may make sense for you to be joining the Worldwide Fund for Nature, right? That makes sure that more of these elephants and giraffes actually have a chance to exist when you want to go on the safari. That's a typical example of an option value, right? You're not consuming this good right now, but you want to retain the option of using it when these circumstances arrive, okay? And they arrive with a certain predictability, right? And that's the option value, right? So the giraffe and the elephant being around and you not seeing them has an option value because you may want to see them in the future, right? And in that context, right, this option will be valuable, right? So this is the option value that they provide, right? And a little bit still more esoteric is this exploration value or quasi-option value, which is when your valuation of when the usefulness of the good depends on new information becoming available, right? Okay. So the fact that, for example, you may want to protect, the Amazon rainforest, right? Because you think that advances in science will enable us to use, bioactive compounds that exist in the biodiverse habitat of the Amazon in a way that actually, produces new cancer drugs or stuff like that, right? So this says that we're not interested in protecting it purely because we want to have the option, but this option becomes more valuable. It needs to be retained, right? Because we believe that information will arrive, right? It's going to make it more valuable, right? So you want to pay essentially to maintain this ecosystem, right? Because you want to delay conversion because you think that information may arrive that makes this thing useful, okay? So quasi-option value or real options. Okay. So these are all use values. All these stories I told you are related to some way in which we can actually talk about a direct benefit, right? In terms of eating apples, enjoying amenities in the park, maintaining the option of enjoying these amenities of this consumption, maintaining the option of exploiting them given that new information about their usefulness arrives in the future, okay? But it's also clear that as we go in this direction, right, things become a bit harder to measure, right? You can see that in order to get to these values, you're going to have more effort, right, to tease them out in a way that actually really nails the issue. And this becomes even more important once we go to non-use, right? So non-use values are values where the stories you tell are no longer about you as the consumer being the beneficiary. What you need to make statements about is that you have other regarding preferences, right? So there's something in your utility function that says, well, I care about not, goods and services that I consume, but about goods and services that somebody else consumes, right? Or will be able to consume, right? And one of these things is existence value, right? And so this is the idea that you know for a fact that you will never see giraffes and lions and elephants because you actually hate Africa, right? You will never travel to Africa. But you like the idea, right, of them being around. You like the idea that there are giraffes and elephants in Africa, and you're willing to pay for them, right? And we know that people do this because most of the sector of wildlife conservation relies on people paying for the maintenance of biodiverse habitats in areas of the world where they themselves will never travel to, right? And that's a manifestation of existence value, right? So to the extent that you maintain them because you want to go and see them, right? Well, this is an option value. To the extent that you pay for their conservation and knowing that you will never see them, well, that is a manifestation of existence value, right? And bequest, right, essentially is a variant of this where the idea is that you're willing to pay for this not because you personally care about them, but because you think that the next generation or your kids, should enjoy the possibility, right, of having them around, right? Okay, so this is a bequest value, right? So something where you don't care about it for yourself, you care about it because you want to bequeath it to the next generation, pass it on, right, as part of the heritage, right, of this, right? And of course, out there, obviously, it becomes even more difficult, right, to put a value to this, right? But this is important, right? And I like this slide because it's something that is disarming, to the environmentalists and the ecologists in the room, right? They would never thought that you are thinking about stuff like this, right? So typically, this is an icebreaker, okay, in your conversation with them because they understand that you have a more holistic view, right? That's more than just eating apples, right? Okay. They think that you're about this, okay, but really you're about the whole thing. Right? But you also tell them that it's a bit harder to say something meaningful and reliable about these bits out here. Okay? And we need to have a method, right, that allows us to get to these bits. And this is the overview of the method, right? So based on these different values, there's an entire universe of approaches, right, that allows you to get to these values. And essentially what I'm going to be spending today on, right, is to kind of go through these different approaches and give you an idea about, first of all, what they are, right, and how they tie to these different use categories, right? So here, essentially, you recognize that some of these things that you just saw there, right, are still here, right? We have use values and non-use values, right? So they still exist, right? And essentially, there are, three basic methods around. So this is the easiest part, right? If you have an existing market for this thing that you're trying to value here, typically in use values, well, you're done, right? You go out there, you take the market price for apples, right? And well, then how much it's worth to be, increasing apple production by 10% a year by maintaining, the apple plantations in whatever, what do you want to do, wherever you guys grow apples, right? Okay, so that's the easy part, okay? The more difficult parts are these bits and these bits, right? Namely, there are two major, approaches, and they have their benefits and their problems in each way. So one way, two basic approaches are this revealed preference and stated preference methods. And revealed preference methods, essentially rely on this idea that we can observe behavior on the marketplace, people taking real choices under real budget constraints on real markets. We can use this information to make an inference, to infer the price and the value of an environmental good from the behavior on markets that do exist, right? And there are a couple of approaches that do this, and this is what we're going to be spending the first part of the morning on, right? Namely, we're going to be looking at hedonic pricing, right? And there are typically two areas of application, the property market and the labor market, where people use behavior on these markets to make inferences about non-market goods, right? But apart from hedonic pricing, there are a couple other methods, travel costs, avertive behavior, right? And these types of approaches have a slightly different methodology, but they're based on the same idea, namely we use observable behavior, right, to make an inference about this thing that we don't see. It's a little bit like in astronomy, where through astronomy you only see the bright stars, you cannot see the dark stars, right? But you know that the dark star is there because the star you can see wouldn't behave like this, right, if this dark star did not exist. So you can infer the existence of the dark star from observing the behavior of the star that you can see. And that's the basic idea that underpins this. So we'll talk about these in more detail in the first part. The second idea, right, and that's, is stated preferences, right? And stated preferences is the idea that, we simply go to the consumer and ask them, how much would you be willing to do this? But of course, that's a very different exercise because we ask, how much would you be willing to pay for this thing, right? So there's a strong hypothetical dimension, right, in this because we tell them that imagine there was a market, imagine there was a price for this, right? How much is it that you would be willing to give up in order to increase the supply of this good, right? And again, there are kind of different, approaches. So a lot of it is done what's called through contingent valuation, right? So we need to spend some time on this, right? And there are also kind of choice models that essentially most of them used to discrete choice experiments. So choice experiments that kind of give you, something that's a bit more that obeys the budget constraint a bit more tightly than the stuff that works on a contingent valuation, right? And then finally, not on this because this is rather recent, there are experimental approaches, right? And I'll talk about those a little bit as well today and also next week, how you might use experiments, right, to actually get to some of these valuations. Now, one thing you can see straight away from this graph, right, is that these methods are not independent of the value that you're trying to investigate, okay? So it's not accidental that the revealed preferences are close to the use values, right, and the stated preferences are close to the non-use values, because it so happens that, you know, this is where they get used most of the time, because investigating non-use values, for example, through revealed preferences is almost impossible. There's no data out there very often that allows you to have a really tight identification of this, right? So based on this, it's very clear that, if you're interested more in these bits here, right, then, you have a certain prejudgment, right, towards using stated preference methods. And then finally, right, all this stuff here, ends up in some kind of valuation, right? So you could give an assessment of the total economic value of some environmental good, right, by going through these very different methods to all home in on these different value categories that this good provides, right? In the end, then, you get this total economic value, and then you might be engaging in something called benefits transfer, right? And what is benefits transfer? Well, essentially, it's an approach where you use estimates on good X at time Y at place Z, right? And you say, well, given that we know this for this good here and there at this time, can we use this and make a statement about how this value how close this value would be if we looked at a different location or a different point in time, right? So it's taking estimates from one context and trying to use them to provide an estimate for another context. And why do you do this? Well, because conducting these studies is very expensive, right? So if you find a shortcut that gives you a predictable way of moving an estimate that was derived for Sao Paulo and urban parks and say, well, we did this for Sao Paulo, maybe we have an urban park in Rio de Janeiro, can we use this information from Sao Paulo? Well, is there a method, right? And there is a method called benefits transfer that allows you to convert, estimates from place A in time X to, place B at time Z, okay? So this is the idea. We're not going to be talking about this, but I'm just highlighting that it exists, right? So this is very often something that is important for people who are engaged in planning, right? Because very often your employer, your agency doesn't give you the money to be doing your own study, right? But they may give you a small budget, right, to allow you to kind of look at the studies and check to what extent they apply to your place, right? So this is the basic idea that's behind this. Giant literature on this, okay, just to highlight that it exists. Okay, so I want to start with revealed preferences, but I think we're going to be starting with a coffee break, 10:40. so let's have a coffee break first. How much time do you need? 15 minutes? I think so, yeah. Okay, so if we're back here 5 to 11, is that good? Okay, and then I think this provides us with a nice break. Okay, let's do that.